Thank you very much. I should also just say, to establish my bona fides, I was also a member of the team which put together the Cambridge history of the First World War, and I was responsible for the bit on revolution. And I should just also say that when we put together the Cambridge history, we were adamant that this was not going to be a series of national histories, but a transnational history. So that if you look at it, there are absolutely no articles at all in all of the 3 volumes which deal with any specific, which are country specific. Anyway, I first want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me, and also to thank, in his absence, Alexander Semyonov, who's responsible for passing my name on, who unfortunately can't be here today. And so in his absence, I want to thank him as well. And what I want to do is talk in fairly general terms, not simply about Russian Revolution, but how we have come to regard the what I call the revolutionary wave over the course of the 20th century. And I'd like to begin by noting, as my colleague, we were together in Freiburg a few years ago, Jörg Boborowski, who has reminded us that history is a science that gives answers to the present and not the past. And each era sees the history of the revolutionary upheaval during and after the First World War in terms of its own concerns and preoccupations. And our preoccupations today are nationalism and violence. The questions that are posed today, I would argue, are rather different than those which were posed by historians a generation ago when I was a student, when I was trained. Not so long ago, and again, this is autobiographical as well, the story of the revolutionary unrest that spread across the European continent. And I should just say parenthetically, that story was framed very largely in European terms. I mean, we didn't discuss what happened in Egypt, we didn't discuss what happened in Puerto Natales in southern Chile, but it was very much European. It tended to be seen within the frame of class-based ideologies and of political movements which were inspired by those ideologies. And these, in turn, as you know, were viewed as products of industrialization, the consequent growth of organized labor, of an industrial proletariat, increasingly conscious of their own class interests, supposedly, of the creation of a revolutionary class. And today, discussions of revolutionary Europe framed in this way have a rather outdated feel. And the idea of the Russian Revolution as a model or an inspiration, I think, has rather evaporated. As Kathy Meredale has observed, she observed the dawn of the new millennium in her book, Night of Stone, the world of Bolshevism has become a foreign country. So today, I would argue the focus on the period extending from the revolutions of 1917 and 1918 until 1922, 1924, is more likely to be the continuum of violence that took hold over large swathes of the former territories of Austria-Hungary, of Tsarist Russia, and of Ottoman Turkey. Historians no longer focus so much on the debates of revolutionaries as on the violence that was a legacy of their revolution. And our understanding increasingly mirrors that of Pavel Milyukov, who's foreign minister in the provisional government, who regarded the Russian Revolution subsequently as an earthquake, as he said, that swept away the thin veneer of civilization. And today's representative book of this period, I would argue, is the volume that was published by my colleague Robert Gerwart just a few months ago, called The Vanquished: Why the First World War Failed to End. I mean, this is a transnational account that focuses on the violence of the revolutionary wave from 1917 to 1923. Now historians are obsessed less with communist legacies as such than with legacies of violence. If we now seek a representative image of this period, it's not the famous socialist realist painting that you all know of Lenin on the Tribune by Gerasimov, but rather the shocking photo which Orlando Figes reproduced in his People's Tragedy of a Polish officer, some of you may know this, killed by Red forces during the war against Poland in 1920. And what it is, it's a naked man hanged upside down, beaten, cut, and tortured until he died. In Germany, the country for which Marxist revolutionaries had held the highest hopes for a successful revolution, and in which many looked to their Russian comrades for inspiration, the historiographical picture is also shifting. As Mark Jones concludes in his recent book, Founding Weimar, Violence in the German Revolution of 1918-1919, he wrote, while the levels of violence in Germany never matched the worst aspects of the post-imperial shadow zones, the ones that people are living in, for all its achievements, the Weimar Republic also was founded on excessive violence. The story of that revolution, the revolution that brought down the Hohenzollern monarchy and gave birth to the Weimar Republic, no longer is framed by Marxist-inspired analysis, as it often was in the 60s and the 70s when I was a student amongst other places in Germany. And when much historical writing looked hopefully to the supposed revolutionary potential of the council movement. Instead, we're more likely to see a Germany in violent upheaval, and one which, and this is as the army command in Dresden described conditions in the Pirna district outside of Dresden as reminiscent of the period after the 30 Years' War. I mean, this metaphor comes up and again, the chaos of the 30 Years' War being repeated. We also have become much less likely to see the revolutionary wave of 1917-1923 as heralding an era of secularism and of receding religious faith. And I think that in our discussions generally, we should consider religion, attitudes toward religion, perhaps more than we've done thus far. This revolutionary wave not only began with the instant desacralization of high politics, disestablishment of the state church, and the dispossession of ecclesiastical property in Russia, it also encompassed a German revolution that broke the link between church and state, and I think probably most importantly, replaced the Ottoman Empire in Turkey with a secular republic established by Kemal Atatürk in October of 1923, and the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate shortly thereafter in the spring of 1924. And the consequences of this remain with us today. It may have seemed that after the upheavals of the early part of the 20th century, this tide of secularism would push religion to the margins. But today things look rather different. Not only Islam, but also the Russian Orthodox Church are resurgent, and the Soviet bookshops that had sections devoted to atheism. And I recall this when I visited the Soviet Union in 1975. Rather than religion, and this is a rather distant memory of people my age, not people of the age of many of you here. Now, a few years ago, in an article entitled Violent Russia, Deadly Marxism, Russia in the Epoch of Violence, 1905 to 1921, Peter Holquist, who's one of the leading historians pushing this line, began by observing that the Russian Revolution has become a preferred topic for discussing modern political violence. Given both the type and extent of the violence of during this period, such a focus, he writes, is entirely justified. Now, various theories have been put forward to explain this explosion of violence. Some have been framed within the idea of a unique Russian path to modernity. I mean, everybody has his or her Sonderweg, a path in which the Russian path, and I quote, past and Russian backwardness has made Russian society particularly prone to convulsions of violence. Orlando Figes, the source of this revolutionary tragedy lay in the legacies of the people's own cultural backwardness rather than the evil of some alien Bolsheviks. It was the weakness of Russia's democratic culture which enabled Bolshevism to take root. And this is Orlando speaking, not me. This was the legacy of Russian history, of centuries of serfdom and autocratic rule. The Russians were trapped by the tyranny of their own history, end quote. Another way of explaining the violence of the revolution and its aftermath has been to view it as inherent in the ideology that propelled its leading protagonists, as the product of an ideology that immediately and inexorably unfolds into violence and terror. Examining the deportation of the Terek Cossacks between April 1920 and January 1921, my York colleague Shane O'Rourke observed that the millenarian strain that underlay Bolshevik ideology made it particularly inclined to seek total solutions to problems rather than partial ones based on compromise or negotiation. Yet, and here's where I come in, when you try to explain the violence, I think there's no escaping the effects of the war and of the First World War. The profoundly revolutionary character of the First World War lay in that it constituted, as Michael Gaia has observed, the beginning of a civilization break, a rupture in civility that shook Europe to its foundations. And I quote Michael Gaia, the general history of the 20th century is the history of the aftershocks of the First World War. It is the history of trauma inflicted by fighting. And this was most extreme in the East. And although recent research, and again you can see this reflected to some extent in our Cambridge project, although recent research is beginning to make good the deficits in our knowledge, the First World War in the East and also in the South, in the Southeast, has long been the forgotten war fought on the forgotten front. While Russia's First World War may have been overshadowed by revolution and the scale of the destruction during the Civil War that followed, the First World War set the stage for what followed. Speaking in Rostov-on-Don in November 1919, Peter Struve put it, I think, quite well, when he said that while the World War formally ended with the conclusion of the armistice, in fact, from that time, all that we've experienced and that we continue to experience is a continuation and transformation of the World War. Now, this suggests that instead of bracketing the years of normal war, 1914, 1917, and those of the Revolution and Civil War, that is 1917, 1921, 22, as separate periods, it's more productive to speak of an extended convulsion over the period 1914, 1921, 22. When seen in this way, the expanded chronology of the war from 1914 through 1921 does not set Russia off from the rest of Europe, even though the success of the Bolsheviks here in 1917 and the violence of the Civil War lent events in Russia a more extreme character than what occurred in the West. But this is a matter of degree and not of type. In this light, Russia's civil wars might be seen as only the most extreme case of a more extended Central and East European civil war stretching through and beyond the Great War. And the First World War, as I've tried to suggest, opened a Pandora's box of violence. Not only the battles along the military fronts, but the brutalities of occupation, the atrocities committed against civilian populations, the forced removal of something approaching 1 million people, mostly Jews and ethnic Germans in the western provinces of the Russian Empire, and proposals for making preparations to liquidate without trace this alien element at the end of the war, cast Europe and its periphery into a storm of violence. That these themes have become central concerns in the recent historiography of the First World War and of the years immediately following reflects, I think, both a better understanding of the history of those times And also, and here's where I come to the core of what I want to say, also more recent cultural preoccupations. Now, whilst diplomatic maneuvering, political movements, military campaigns continue to be subjects of historical investigation, increasingly it's the sufferings of civilians, the campaigns of forced removal, of atrocity, of genocide that have come to the fore. In his fine study of disabled victims of the First World War, of German victims, Robert Weldon Whalen articulated this perspective, I think, quite well, when he concluded that the 20th century was, and I quote from Whalen, was preeminently the century of the survivor of Hiroshima, the survivor of Auschwitz. The victims of the Great War were the first generation of survivors. They are our ancestors. Their experience is our own. I mean, I don't believe this last bit. I mean, I don't think that their experience is the experience of our own today, but nonetheless, I leave that on the table. But the topos of contemporary historical inquiry, and this I think is the key point, is not so much today war and revolution as it is violence and victimhood. By stressing the violence unleashed by the revolutionary events of 1917, 1923, increasingly we focus on the emotional content of revolution rather than the supposedly objective interests that underlined it. A century ago, Georg Simmel observed in his Sociology of Conflict, and I quote, that it is useful to hate the opponent with whom one is for any reason struggling, and that no serious struggle can long continue without being supported by a complex of psychic impulses. And to a considerable degree, we see how fear and hatred drove revolutionaries and framed their decisions. And these are decisions which led to the imprisonment and death of huge numbers of people. Now, this fear and hatred encompassed not only the enemies on the other side of the class divide, but also included fear on the part of the Workers' Party, of the workers themselves. And once in power, self-styled representatives of workers' interests often felt threatened by the workers that they thought they were representing. And here I think we see an important source of the violence that the revolution directed against entire groups of people, including those whose interests the revolutionaries ostensibly represented. People became defined as enemies, betrayers of the revolution, who deserved neither understanding, sympathy, nor mercy. And here I want to quote also a Benjamin, but not Walter, who's been quoted many times yesterday, but rather his sister-in-law, Hilda Benjamin. Hilda Benjamin, as some of you may know, achieved prominence as the merciless vice president of the Supreme Court of the German Democratic Republic between 1949 and 1953. And she later became a GDR, a justice minister. I mean, she once asserted in an article, this was, I think it was in the 1960s, if I remember correctly, and I quote, "As soon as my son could begin to understand, I've answered his questions truthfully, at any rate so he could understand. He had to understand whom and why he had to hate." Now, such expressions now attract condemnation in societies that, at least in the public sphere, have become increasingly sensitive toward violence. Now, we talk about violence more in order to identify with it less. Decades ago, that's before the collapse of the Soviet Union, many sought to identify themselves with revolutionary ideology and politics and their legacy, not least during the upsurge of apparently revolutionary politics in the 1960s, which I'm old enough to remember. More recently, however, we've tended to identify not with the revolutionary leaders, but as I said before, with their victims. The obsession with and rejection of violence in the developed world since roughly the middle of the 20th century has paralleled a distancing from the revolution of 1917 and its legacy. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that we now necessarily are guided by what Steven Pinker famously has referred to as the better angels of our nature, quoting Abraham Lincoln. Either Pinker is necessarily right or necessarily wrong for that matter. And that's another argument when he asserts that today we may be living in the most peaceable era in our species' existence. Rather, what I'm talking about is attitudes, about ways of seeing, about attempts at understanding, not about some comparative historical measure of violence, which I think is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to make in a meaningful sense. Whether or not we and the societies in which we live have become more violent by some supposedly objective measure, we certainly have become more sensitive towards violence since mid-20th century. And this, I would argue, has shaped the ways in which historians have come to regard the revolutionary wave of 1917 to 1923, roughly. The 20th century frequently has been described as the most violent century ever. The first half of which was an era of revolution, violent revolution and counter-revolution, of civil wars and world wars that cost millions of people their lives. During the second half of the 20th century, however, a different concept of revolution gained traction, whereby fundamental change was regarded as desirable and achievable through nonviolence. And this came up a bit in our discussions yesterday. The understanding of what constitutes legitimate revolution, one with which we could more readily identify, changed. And this is the sort of thing that really caused Arno Mayer to explode in another one of his rages. The late 20th century's model for revolution in Europe was not the Russian Revolution, but rather the Velvet Revolution that brought down state socialism in Czechoslovakia. And its revolutionary heroes were not Lenin or Mao, but Václav Havel and Martin Luther King Jr. More recently, while populist and nationalist politics have been resurgent in country after country, the reference points for today's radicalism also are not to be found in the revolutions of 1917 and shortly thereafter. As Steve Smith concluded in a recent survey, and I think a really superb overview of recent research on the Russian Revolution, he wrote, "Historians today are more likely to see the revolution as the initiation of a cycle of violence that led inexorably to the horrors of Stalinism and Nazism, rather than as a flawed attempt to create a better world." I mean, he goes on to say that this has perhaps acted as a barrier to our understanding of much that actually did go on and propelled the revolutions of 1917 and beyond. But that's not an argument that I want to take up here today. The point is that revolution appears not as inspiration, but as nightmare. Now, in closing, I just want to refer to this. And as I say, to quote Arnold Schwarzenegger, look at the hand. And so I want to turn to this image of Lenin, the revolutionary, but it's, as you may be able to see, in a rather unfamiliar setting. This is in Seattle in the United States. In mid-August of 2017, and this was in the wake of the violence that surrounded demands that a statue of the Confederate military commander and slave owner, I should say, Robert E. Lee, be removed in Charlottesville, Virginia. Supporters of Donald Trump demanded the removal of this statue of Lenin, which was erected. I mean, it's actually on private property, so it's not a matter of any government thing. It's private property, so it's problematical about how you get rid of it. But it's on a square in front of a bunch of cafes and so forth, as you can see in public view. In Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, I mean, sort of countercultural, gentrified um, neighborhood fairly typical of its kind. And according to them, that is the people who wanted this removed, the statue represented hatred and bigotry. It had no place in America, they said, as Lenin was responsible for the deaths of millions of people, and they wanted to disavow what they referred to as leftist violence. Now this 7-ton statue, it had been erected by the Bulgarian artist Emil Venkov, and originally had been erected in Slovakia in the town of Propad in 1988. And so the statues of Lenin erected in 1988 didn't have a terribly rosy future where they were erected, and it only lasted there about a year before it was toppled. But it was found by an American art lover by the name of Louis Carpenter, and he'd actually taught in this town in Propad, and he admired it so much that he mortgaged his home to pay for it and to be shipped to the United States. And there it is. And as you can see, somebody has painted the hand red for blood. And I want to end with the quotation from the Fremont neighborhood website describing this, where they write, "It's unique. We believe that it's the only representation portraying Lenin surrounded by guns and flames instead of holding a book or waving his hat. The sculptor, while fulfilling the requirements of his state commission, was nevertheless able to express his vision of Lenin as a violent revolutionary, not just an intellectual and theoretician." And I would leave you with the thought that, in that sense, this is indeed a representation of Lenin for our time. Thanks for your attention.
Those of you who read my book in English or in Russian, I mean the first one, would be bored for the first 15 minutes, but I hope I'll entertain you a little bit in the last 15. So I will be talking more or less about the short Soviet century, meaning the long-term trends in cultural change and transmission of some practices which are central for self-cognition and self-fashioning, and this was one of the preoccupations of mine. My approach to Michel Foucault when I tried to study him was not actually to study him, but rather to use him to analyze the culture which I knew best. And we did it in a way parallel together with Kotkin, but if Kotkin mapped the thesis of Foucault directly onto Soviet experience, saying that it was confessional culture which formed the individual, and it was hierarchical discipline which created the Soviet civilization. Mine was a comparative analysis because I claimed that central for the Soviet civilization was not confessional methods of self-cognition, but rather penitential ones. And instead of hierarchical discipline, it was horizontal discipline, which is more important in the formation of the commonly society. Now, as I said, it's boring for those of you who read it, but let me restate some of the points here. Now, if one takes a look at the unpublished volume 4 of History of Sexuality and then the lectures which were published and some articles which Foucault did deliver here and there, he juxtaposed two methods of self-cognition in early Christianity. One was called with an unpronounceable word exagoreusis, which then ended up in John the Cassian and the founder of Western monasticism, Benedict of Nursia. This allegedly transformed itself then into confessional practices. Western man, and he wrote about man, not a woman, wrote Foucault produces himself through the confession to a priest, to a psychoanalyst, through introspection. Now, but he simultaneously, of course, noticed that there was a different strand of early Christian practices, which was coming to know oneself through protracted penitence. Basically, it was some kind of aggressive silence which was coming with it. There was no confession in words. There was no endless meal of words, Foucault said. Rather, the practice was called exomologesis and was about showing the sinning self in all of its splendor to the brethren while being silent and performing certain penitential deeds, like crawling in the ashes, beating oneself, castigating, macerating one's flesh. I mean, all of these words which we forgot right now. Now, this contrast between two types of self-cognition suggested to me that the Soviets might have relied more on the second type of practices rather than on confessional practices. We always quarrel with Alexander Etkind, who believes that psychoanalysis is deeply rooted in Soviet and Russian culture. I think it's an aberration. Americans pay for that because they don't have friendship enough. Russians confess to friends instead of going to the shrink. Another thing is that we don't have that deeply rooted in local culture because there's no confessional background as such. Exomologesis, as we know, among the early Christians, was practiced because it revealed to the brethren through a particular penitential deed the real self. And in the Soviet version of the same, it seemed that people came to know who they are as a conscious builder of communism when during the purges their deeds were reviewed by a relevant community and the knowledge of themselves were established and ascertained. Also, don't forget that the purges is not about you being taken away there to Lithuania 4 and being shot in the backyard. The purge is a mass procedure where everybody is screened on whether he or she corresponds to the high image of the builder of communism. Whether he will be shot dead in the end of it, it's an outcome which is not necessarily part of the purge. The purge is a screening, cleaning, verification procedure. I mean, the executions is another thing. Now, what we take a look at the purges, of course, through 24 to 38 when they were practiced, officially until 34. And of course we see that the Bolsheviks, what they did is that they radicalized this early Christian practice of exomologesis. That is, they started reviewing the deeds of every communist and then of every Soviet citizen to an extent to try to see whether these deeds exemplified the high image of the builder of communism. So in a sense, what they did what Augustine, Luther, and Calvin did. They pinpointed the central practice of a certain Christian denomination and tried to radicalize it. After Augustine, as we know, confession, and particularly auricular confession, even if it was demanded by Lateran Council, was lying dormant. It was Luther who revived it, and then Calvin also. And Western individual became a confessing individual because it was through radicalization of these confessional methods of coming to know who you are by analyzing your desires, looking into yourself through introspection, or through confessing to a confessor or psychoanalyst, that they came to know who we are in the Western world. Now, what the Bolsheviks did, and that was my hypothesis in the book, they basically took another line of self-cognition, which was inherent to Christianity, but it was more practiced in Eastern Christianity than in Western one. It starts with Tertullian and St. Jerome, then practiced all the way in Byzantium, and then it's picked up by the Bolsheviks. This is this thing, exomologesis. Once again, you shouldn't also mix up, people who read the book unattentively, mix up public confession and public penance. Public penance is done, it might be done in a very kind of a remote, aggressive silence. You have to show who you are with your deeds rather than publicly confess. Public confession is part, of course, of Calvinist discipline. It's a different story completely. So the show trials and everything in Moscow in 1930s, it's an aberration rather than the real communism. The real communism is the mass purges where 3 million communists undergo the screening procedure every year, or let's say every 3 years, when they figure out one after one whether the comrades will vote on their pure character, on whether they correspond to the high image of communism. So in a sense, once again, we can take a look at the transformation of the practices of belief, and then wouldn't then the communist revolution seem similar to the Protestant Reformation? Luther and Calvin reformed the practice of confession, radicalizing it, taking it out of dormancy and making it central to a new renewed Christianity. The Bolsheviks more or less did the same, but with different practice, not of confession, but rather of penitential self-cognition. And they achieved similar results. If Protestant Reformation, as we know, established the roots of West European individuality and individualization, then under Stalin and communism, Soviet Union created its own version of individuality and individualism, but based in East European practices of self-cognition. The Russian term which testifies to that, of course, is the word which I put into the title of my Russian book. It's обличение. The word most often means right now accusation and denouncement of the sins, but if one takes a look at the structure of the word and one takes the prefix ob from the root Russian word which for лицо, which means face of person, then of course one can translate it as endowing someone with individual personhood or personality. Even when one criticizes the deeds or misdeeds of someone, one still at the same time endows this person with a certain personality, even though this personality is negative. But there of course were many cases in the purges when people were endowed with a positive personality, and that is also described as обличение. So if обличение is an impersonation, for those of you who don't speak Russian but rather speak English, you can see that I'm trying to translate it this way to show the root structure of the Russian word. It's a process that makes a person's personality manifest, just as endowing someone might establish a dowry, encircling brings out a circle, and ensuring brings out assurance or surety. So when the mass purges radicalized обличение, they also radicalized Stalinist individualization. And as the book argues, the era of the cult of personality of Stalin of course, can be also characterized the way the great Soviet pedagogical worker Makarenko proclaimed it. It was actually the era of the mass cultivation of personality. Actually, not of Stalin, but of every worker, peasant, and others who, for the first time in their lives, had to stand up during the purges with a piece of paper in their hands, shaking with emotion, and to have to account for themselves in first person singular in front of the relevant others, and basically to do something about it. So it's a massive wave of individualization in which the country underwent under Stalin rather than defacing them. And by the way, if you want to read about the cult of personality, as we know right now, you shouldn't read about Stalin, you should read about Kerensky, as Boris's book has just shown. Hopefully it will be translated soon, so into English. Now, where do we get here? This introduction is more or less over. Once again, if West European individual, according to Foucault, was born as a confessing animal, then was the communist individual born as a penitent beast? This was the initial hypothesis. Well, perhaps. But the story was that my book was written as a genealogy, meaning I used the anthropological and historical material to estrange the current practices. There was no claims there about the history of what was going on in the 20s and the 30s. If I did, the historians would have killed me, because I was just using published sources on purge manuals, for example. I never went to the archives. So I basically did what Foucault was doing. He took some published texts, he said, take a look at those texts, you see who you are, and that's what the book did. I mean, take a look at whether you still practice these things, guys. Actually, I just had one of my former students who is about to be purged from the state shipbuilding company right now. She just wrote to me that she was chased out of her office by the same methods. So the people still recognize themselves in this account on the formation of Communist Party cells in the purges. But there was no positivist argument there. It was not a book about reality. It was a book about estranging contemporary practices which might be still sharing. And imagine to what surprise I was predisposed when Anatoly Chubais suggested to us in 2011-2013 that we will have an opportunity to have this hypothesis tested. Meaning, was обличение widespread? Was this impersonation practices based on Eastern penitential culture, were they receding, were they enlarging? What happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Now, he of course was more interested in all of this Medvedev modernization drive and trying to figure out whether cultural blocks were in the way of Russian modernization, whether prevalent practices of self-recognition were standing in the way of high-tech development in Russia. We agreed to do this study, but simultaneously we had the right to do a kind of our corollary study piggybacking on the main study, trying to figure out what's really was going on with self-fashioning practices. And right now we are entering, the social science account, meaning the positivist account. I'm leaving the type philosophy genealogy grounds and getting to empirical social science. So from now on you can criticize this on the basis of the usual positivist account. The team was huge. I mean, we tried to do the biggest cross-cultural research ever done in the last 25 years, because Rasnana had lots of money and we decided to do it right. Meaning we decided to fail in all the ways the Americans failed in their big studies in the 60s and 70s. Meaning we conducted our study in the native languages in 4 countries. The 3 comparable countries to Russia were Taiwan, Korea, and Finland. We conducted it using native languages, then we're retranslating everything into Russian and comparing it on the basis of Russian hidden predispositions of what was going on in between those cultures. So all the cultural criticism of what Americans were doing in big cross-cultural, cross-national research in the 60s and 70s, work was repeated by us, but we decided we had to do it at least once in Russia if we had the opportunity. We chose 4 regions of Russia to see for cross-regional variation. And Taiwan and Korea were chosen because they were also authoritarian when they started their modernization. So the company which commissioned research wanted to say why Taiwan had their managers controlled by the security services like Russia, but they developed and we don't. So we also took Korea because Korea had a huge Protestant conversion rate, and it was important to compare the Taiwan, which is syncretic or Buddhist or Confucian, with Korea, which had a huge Protestant population. And then we took Finland as a contrast case because it is completely Protestant. So the idea was to take a look at different practices of self-fashioning. Now, the findings should have been stated long ago in a book, because the person who organized it all was Boris Gladerev, with whom we worked for years. The problem with Boris is that when he was about to finish the book, he decided that he is Jewish, and right now he's learning Hebrew somewhere in Israel. Having completely disappeared, he had got the money to publish the book. He never delivered neither the book nor the money back, and we don't know what to do about it. I mean, this is a perfect socialist talent, You have to do something, you go to Israel.
And if you look for him, he will accuse you of anti-Semitism.
Well, sorry, no. I just want my book back, as Target said.
But he's not even Jewish.
Yeah, he's not even, well, listen, I mean, who is Jewish and who is not, we're not going to enter into this discussion. Then you will accuse me, Well, anyway, so right now the Science and Technology Studies Center has a difficult and unthankful goal to finally bring this book to publication. And if Olga Bычkova is there, she has... is Olga there?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't see her, but she will finally produce that in print when we assemble this research and publish it. But what I will talk about right now in the remaining 10 minutes or so, which I have, is basically what were the findings. Well, the first one, of course, if I take a look at what self-fashioning is geared to these days and how it's compared to the Russian Revolution, at the level of discourse, the change is obvious. It's 100% changed. It was all about self-sacrifice in the Bolshevik Revolution. This was the ultimate telos of self-transformation. You had to submit yourself to the goals of revolution and kill yourself if the revolution demanded. Right now, it's self-realization. Now, it can be creative self-destruction, like Jim Morrison, but very often it's not. Very often it's self-realization through embellishment, as some of our respondents said. So the USSR discourse, which is also about self-improvement, self-fashioning, self-command, is gone. I was surprised to what extent the respondents were all speaking about samorealizatsiya, because if you take a look at samorealizatsiya in the dictionaries of Russian literary language from the 60s and 70s, it's not there. The word was not registered. And it's not registered in philosophical treatises also. It was registered, the only book where I found it, summarization term, is in the critique of the bourgeois misrepresentation of the essence of human nature. Because allegedly it was taken from Abraham Maslow's theory, of the pyramid of needs, and it was supposed to be a complete misrepresentation of what people are all about. But finally, right now, through the manuals of business schools, it came into the forefront, at least at the level of discourse of self-fashioning and self-achievement. But more interesting is basically what happened to the practices rather than discourse. And we were asking questions on small things because we understood that if we talk about big things, the moral reasoning would give strong injunctions for the people to lie or to say something normative rather than what was going on. So we started asking them how they used gadgets in planning their days, how smartphones would relate to day planners, traditional ones, and take a look at how they come to know who they are right now. And it turned out to be that what I articulated as a hypothesis studying the Stalinist purges through formal and informal media seems to still be there. Of course, the techniques of revelation by deeds, as we call it, techniques of обличения, techniques of exomologesis, are still there, but they are more widespread among the aging population, those who grew up in the Soviet days, or in some tightly knit communities, like all of these KVN clubs or some other kind of professional clubs. They still practice the tight cohesive techniques, which, as we saw in Novosibirsk. Among the young, we saw that there's not really much going on in terms of people getting together and reflecting on the personality of some of the members of the group. Of course, if it happens very often in professional individualization, but it's not about morality, it's more about the forums and the gatherings of relevant colleagues when they establish the professional identities of each other. So as we see right now, if we take the terms of social psychologist Henry Tetchfeld, professional identity eclipses personal identity or other types of social identity. When people try to establish who they are with the help of a relevant group, they do not look at ethnic, confessional, regional, age identities or gender identities. Rather, they don't even take a look at a kind of a universal, uniform moral identity. They more talk about themselves as professionals. One can also say that there are new arenas for обличение, for this impersonation technique. And these are not only professional conferences right now, industry competitions and prizes, talks between relevant colleagues, but these are not also, by the way, traditional Russian birthday party, which is of course very different from traditional American birthday party. For those of you who haven't been to the States, I'm telling Russians mostly. Imagine my first surprise. I came to Berkeley to study. Susan helped me at some point to give me advice to go to Berkeley. So we go to have a birthday party with my friend. We go to the Ethiopian restaurant, the six of us pretending that the guy whom we're taking out, he doesn't know that he will be treated for birthday. Then the six of us each give $1 and we feed him a $6 meal, and everybody says, happy birthday, and that's the end of it. And you kind of say, wow, and where's the birthday party? And the answer is that the birthday party, which establishes for the Russian teenager or the 20-year-old a personal identity through the toasting, presents, and everything, that's why it's so important. This birthday party, which is the informal replication of the formal purge procedure which was practiced in the party, that's why it's so central to our civilization. Of course, it's not part of background culture practices in America, that's why it doesn't happen. So these things are still with us, of course, as you know, with birthday parties. But the new things, new arenas have appeared. For example, some of the technological entrepreneurs establish their identities through showing to others not their achievements professionally, but the IPO. When they sell the initial private equity, when they convert it into cash and say, see how cool I am, Not that they produced such a good high-tech device, but rather we finally went to the stage of IPO and I'm really cool. Please tell me I'm cool. So we get here to some kind of transformation of practices. It will be interesting to see when finally the change will happen. It's either these people will go into confessional modes of self-cognition, which are characteristic of many American entrepreneurs. I don't care what you tell me. I don't care, I'm a lonely man. I mean, cash basically tells me whether I'm worth it or not. This would be, the alternative. Whether they go this direction or not, I don't know, but what we saw, at least as a transitional mechanism, is that people started to showing to the relevant others not their moral self, not their professional achievement, but rather, I need this money not to tell me who I am, but I need this money to tell you that actually you see how I earned it and you tell me I'm great because this is an achievement. So in Russian, it's a game, it's a pun. They go from обличение to обналичивание. They go from impersonation to encashment in English. I mean, basically trying to get to a different. But whether it's a decisive change, we couldn't tell because for Russian culture, we studied a very limited population, meaning the technological entrepreneurs, former scientists who went to become entrepreneurs. And whether these guys represent the broader Russian practices, that's a question open to further studies. Now, the second hypothesis, or the second type of stuff which was somehow linked to religion, was the methods practiced by some people in our group, and they decided not to use Foucault, they decided to use Boltanski and Thévenot. French social science is the core methodology very often for Russian social science. So here is the list of all the books of Boltanski and Thévenot. You should know if you want to repeat the methods repeated in our study. But the funny thing is not only the Russians who suffer this childish illness of repeating the French, the Finns also, and the Finns have developed a way to calculate different cités de la justification, which Boltanski and Thévenot articulated when they tried to figure out the universes of everyday disputes. As you know, they initially figured out there were 6, then Boltanski added the 7th in the new spirit of capitalism. So we went to analyze what was being said in the 4 respective countries, how people argued for their justified solutions. And we kicked out all the expert interviews. We had 154 biographical interviews left. And the analysis done of these interviews has shown the specificity of Russia in terms of how people argue for what they do, how they justify their activities. There are 7 modes of justification, as you know, for Boltanski Thévenot, depending on the big political philosophers people use. And these are the mixes of the 3 predominant cités de la justification, or worlds of justification, which they use. And what's surprising about this is not what's going on in Finland, Korea, Taiwan, but rather in Russia. It's element number 2 in the mix. Of course, most Russian technopreneurs say that they do those things to be industrially efficient. But the second thing, which was never mentioned neither in South Asia nor in Protestant Europe, was the appeal to inspiration. And this appeal to inspiration is disproportionate. I mean, we couldn't find almost anything like that in Southeast Asian interviews. There, people just go to earn money. They move out from rural areas to become rich, and that's why they go in technical entrepreneurship. You listen to Russians in Novosibirsk, Irkutsk, Tomsk, Kazan, St. Petersburg, and they all get there because they really want to do something big. They want to change the universe still. Like one guy says, I can do research on the lard melting point, but I'm getting pinned only from the task as the level of the size of the universe. Otherwise, why do all of this crap? The task should have no ceiling. A job or a task should be very interesting, captivating, one should be enraptured by it, engrossed into it totally. Otherwise, why do it? I mean, and actually they're very often like Protestants. Given the fact that everybody can steal your patent in Russia and you cannot defend your property rights, why go and spend 15 years dealing with some hurly-burly developments, which is called in Russian разработка, which will never even become a prototype. It can be stolen from you, or it can basically you spend your money and not gonna get anywhere. And these guys are there because they have this kind of a big sublime mission. And they think of themselves as creators with a capital C. And you shouldn't think of that as a obvious thing. Right now, everybody in Russia, because it's a post-Soviet Union, think they are engaging in creative activities. Not only creative industries, like all of these guys in PR, but creative. Все хотят заниматься творчеством. Everybody wants to be a творческий человек, a creator. This is, of course, the biggest hubris in human history. This is the biggest arrogance, which is the residual story of the Soviet civilization. Why? If you take a look at the word for творец, for the creator, in the first Russian dictionary from the Russian Academy of 1792, the word creator was applicable only to two agents, God and poet. Everybody else was imitating nature. This is a classical Greek dictum. I mean, the artisan cannot invent anything else. Engineer, you must be laughing. Only poets, when they have the frenzy, when they have the godly spirit entering them, they behave a little bit like gods who can create ex nihilo. So how come the country, all of us right now believe that we can have the kind of its high claim to become tvorец, to become something like godlike or close? Well, the usual answer is that there was Romanticism, which first granted the right to become a creator to a painter, a sculptor, and everything. But the big thing which happened in the Soviet Union was that through the wave of technical creativity, so-called, a country of collective creativity in the sphere of technology, as the official decisions of the Soviet government said in the 1920s, the ideology was pumped that every worker should be given this opportunity to become a creator. The funny thing that Gladriev has found the first citation of this technical drive in 1925, signed by whom? I love it, Felix Dzerzhinsky. So it's like everybody becomes a creator, full stop, Felix Dzerzhinsky. And if you don't, you go down, you go another way. Yes, well, you know the story, how it all ended up. Artem, I'll take 2 minutes rather than 1. It's the euphoria, which is very important, of course, in all of this story, that the creativity of something new is very important. And it should be grand, there should be a buzz, you should be клёво, кайфово, otherwise why do it? And you know the religion which epitomizes it all. It's a religion from the 60s. It's the Strugatsky brothers. In America, when they say Strugatsky, nobody knows what it is. Of course, in Russia, this is like the Coen brothers. I mean, meaning that this is like the center of the culture. Strugatsky is the epitome of the communist drive of the 60s, and it's about the idea of transforming the world as gods. The 3 central words, of course, is that Monday starts on Friday. Why? Because they work on Friday like as if this is Monday, or Monday this is Friday, because this is communism, they love it anyway. So it's not like, thank God it's Friday, finally I have my 3 days off. No, I go to work every day because what is the day off? The day off is nothing. It's like when I lose myself. I work every day. I love the novel which everybody forgot, but hopefully Artem will teach it in his classes. It's called Полдень, 22 век, Noon, the 22nd century. It's because Marx and Engels didn't leave the positive description of what communism would look like. So Strugatsky wrote it. It's 350 pages of how it looks in the 22nd century with all the details. Washing machines, you know, conflicts at work. You read it. I mean, this is like that's what really drove people in their things. And then, of course, the last movie which just appeared, but it still carries the same emotion. A very small title. Is it hard to be a god? Трудно быть Богом. Of course, it's not really necessarily about transforming the universe like the physicists wanted to do it, but still. I don't have the time, so I'm not going to give more stories about this. I'll just say that if you compare it to the US, it's a completely unbelievable Soviet arrogant position. The biggest which the US could do was Steve Jobs, whose main motto was, let's leave a dent in the universe. What is a dent? A dent is when a nail hits, I don't know what, a side of a car. Or a dent is when you take a fist and you hit a wall. But what is that, to leave a dent in university? Because the Soviet worker was supposed to gather, to recreate it at all. I mean, a dent. You're talking about what? I mean, I'm here only for the dent. You go and become Steve Jobs. We are here to recreate the world anew, and that was basically the aspiration. So when you look at this last vestiges of the Reformation, I think if one wants to still find the residual communist energy residual communist hubris and the zeal, euphoria, asceticism, frenzy of Protestant-like drive to remake the universe, this repository, we know it's the Strugatsky Bible shared by some of technological entrepreneurs and maybe others. I'm not sure to what extent the Strugatskys have also penetrated the audience sitting here, but we can check it in questions and answers. Thank you.
Obviously, the author corresponds to what he describes. Don't set small tasks to yourself. So, questions? Katie?
I have a question to Oleg. Well, just to mention that this novel Monday starts in День начинается в субботу. It was used as a motto for the Bergen Assembly by Ekaterina Dogut. So the whole triennial in Bergen was dedicated actually to Strugatsky brothers. So it's not in oblivion, just to mention. But my question deals with this issue of penitence in confession practice. And this is communion, right? Because when you go for confession, you have to get communion. And communion is already this additive element which not only brings you to show your deeds and open up for penitence, but as well to get some kind of mercy and atonement. And it's this aim of confession is not only exomologesis, maybe, even in terms of Byzantine practice, but also metanoia. So the change of consciousness from one condition to another condition. And I think this change, this metanoical change, is also very important in terms of transforming the private person into some person of the universal. So I would a little bit maybe doubt confining the procedure of confession to purge predominantly. This is one point, and to what extent you can confine this theological constraint or theological context to Stalinist rendering of communism, and you said that communism is purge. So to what extent you can bring this issue to the communism as a whole?
I see. Well, I think here it's very Foucaultian. I mean, I would be here very orthodox Foucaultian in a sense. Practices can be taken over, re-articulated and remolded. You don't take the whole apparatus, the whole dispositif with all the elements. The Bolsheviks took some things which were important for them. They remolded them, radicalized some aspects, and then put it on the populace. Whether the populace unwillingly gained in all of these transformed practices or not, it's another issue. But you do not have to have a communion necessarily attached to the practice of exomologesis, which right now is used to evaluate the self, not of a Christian, but of a communist. And the difference, for example, is not that it's really continuity, it's also a change, because even in monasteries, in those who really practiced kind of a diehard penitential discipline in, let's say, 19th century, these were very few, of course. Even those monasteries, if we take a look at Vera Shevtsov's work on popular religiosity at the time, only certain deeds were watched. Well, for example, the communists right now, the monks and everybody wouldn't be watching for all the deeds, but right now, after particular radicalization of the purges, every behavior in everyday life might smack of corruption. Like, you have been sneering at this lady. Okay, you didn't beat up your wife, but you've been sneering at this lady, and you have this dangerous temptation lurking in your soul, which might corrupt your communist self. So we'd better stop you from.
Sounds like United States of America.
Well,
it's also penitential.
Well, or alcoholism. It was not a problem at all during the Civil War, but alcoholism suddenly becomes a big problem for the party in 24-26. And then because it shows that there's an alternative allegiance, not to high communism and to the ideals, but rather you can drink yourself to death and something like that. No, I shouldn't be repeating more what I'm saying. Basically, these things don't come in a bundle. They can be disassembled and rechanged.
Well, what I meant was not that metanoia is part of only religious practice, but I meant that not only punishment is the goal of this penitence, but punishment is used to change the consciousness.
Yes.
I think that's what Alex said. I don't think there is any contradiction here.
Yeah,
Richard.
Actually, this is perhaps a bit unfair. I wanted to ask Oleg a question as well, so I take advantage of this, if I may. First, I'd like to just try to rescue Steve Jobs from the condescension of posterity, because there is this famous interchange that he had with a person, I can't remember his name, who was the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, and he was trying to raise capital. And he put the question, do you want to go on selling sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to change the world?
So he picked up some Bolshevik.
Yeah. So Steve Jobs, the closet Bolshevik. But what I wanted to ask about was about the importance of fear. Because to my understanding of what you're talking about, fear plays a role both in the confessional and in the penitential. With regard to the confessional, it's fear of what might happen in the next life. But if you don't believe in a next life, then the fear is what might happen here. And perhaps that's one of the differences between the two. And I was wondering at what point, if you were going to speak about the emotion of fear involved in confessional, and you didn't. And I think we still have this, and we call it performance review. And I imagine people, in whether this is in private industry or whether it's in universities, you get your annual performance reviews. And there's also an element of fear involved in this. That if you're on a temporary contract, it may not be renewed. If you're on permanent contract, you might not be able to advance. And I'll leave you with the one thought about this, which I don't know if it's still the case. I had a friend of mine who worked in France for GE a few years ago, who told me that there the practice was that you would have annual reviews. And every year the program in GE was that 10% of people would get an above inflation increase in salary. 40% would get an inflation increase in salary. 40% would get no increase in salary, and 10% would be sacked every year.
Well, with performance reviews or KPIs or any other means of increasing productivity on the workshop or in office, I mean, we can say that, of course, Western Christian methods and Eastern Christian methods are not necessarily confined to respective civilizations. Every culture is a mix. The question is what is preponderant. I'm pretty sure that many methods of communist stimulation of labor productivity are used by contemporary US corporations, and many methods coming from hierarchical surveillance and metering and individual technical criteria and evaluations and everything are used, of course, by Fordist type elements in the Soviet civilization type of arrangements. In terms of fear, yeah, you're right. In a sense, fear which is this worldly is different from the fear which is otherworldly, and I didn't give it much thought, neither did Foucault. But the fear which I see from the accounts, at least, but these are once again published accounts, so I don't know whether one can trust them or not. One should take a look at the archives. Is that people who for the first time undergo the purge review, these guys are fearing the most. Because this is the first time they will speak in front of the crowd, and they never spoke about their labor biography. Kotkin describes it beautifully about them in his Magnitogorsk book, when people have to stand up for the first time and do something about it. And whether it's fear you'll be executed or some other fear, that's another story.
Susan?
So it was really fantastic or interesting to hear, but I have problems with this, of course, with this method, because it already presumes a certain division, which it seems to me is ahistorical. In other words, there's a Russian culture, and then there's the Western culture, and they're now theologically based, and these theological traditions can transform into even atheistic traditions, but they remain somehow solid. And it seems to me that's very problematic. But let me just then, because I was the one who suggested you go to Berkeley, bring up a certain Berkeley study, The Authoritarian Personality by Adorno, which for me, although very problematic as well, and also it's the West Coast that wants to make this whole thing social science. It's still, now it's into neuroscience, but it's the same. So I would call a certain West Coast mentality very specific, very specific. But what's interesting about the study that Adorno was part of, and he was very much influential in this part of the description, and that is that a certain authoritarian personality is transcultural, and it has certain manifestations that are not limited to culture. And I think it's because he was Jewish and an immigrant in the United States, German Jewish. They were incidentally our teachers, this generation of emigres. But because of this, he was very sensitive to the pinning of a kind of collective consciousness to a culture. But rather spoke in terms of authoritarian responses. If there was any kind of psychological explanation, it had to do actually with patriarchy and things of that nature, but I don't think they're terribly explanatory. I'm just wondering, for instance, that's my background for the question. The question is this. Ayn Rand became extremely important in the United States. And I understand that someone like, the Silicon Valley people today are just all about being cool, but they also want to change the world. And so this individualism that's connected with an entrepreneurial understanding of how you use technology and what you do with it, it seems to me is very much about changing the world. So Steve Jobs doesn't keep his Muslim background. He adopts a certain transnational mentality in this age of a certain kind of technology.
Well, I didn't want to sound as if cultures are immutable or that the Soviet experiment was a continuation of the age-old Russian practices of belief. The title exactly said it was a reformation. And if it was reformed once, it can be reformed anew through merger with other practices or going a different direction. It's just that for almost, well, let's say 40 out of 70 years, the country was playing one game behind the closed doors, and that was trying to establish the self-cognition through specific methods. Now that can actually merge with other methods right now and maybe go in a different direction. There's no mutability, and it might be a transnational thing right now developing amidst of this. With Adorno is a good example, and once again, if I were into immutable culture arguments, I would say that there's a West Coast Christian mentality and an East Coast, well, mentality which you mentioned, but this would be completely a mistake to claim something like that. With I mean, the idea, I guess, is to use the binary opposition which Foucault has articulated as an heuristic tool to initially get at something, to get the specificity of the cultural practices of self-cognition, self-fashioning, and self-evaluation. I mean, before we didn't even look at that. And once we get there, we'll see what we can do. Of course, anything which relies on a binary is too rigid and unfair, and that's why not really fitting. But we'll see to what extent the contemporary mix of different practices of self-fashioning is really transnational. I mean, it seems to me the conservative backlash in Russia in the last 5 to 7 years tries to solidify once again those elements to say that's what we are. Russian is not X in relation to what Germans are, which is Y. but rather they differ by the way they do things. They differ not by the way they say who I am, but by the way they arrive at this knowledge of who I am. And there's this solidification of a certain rigidity of practices of arriving at who I am. I mean, certain methods of arriving seem to be banned, or at least some of the people who write the speeches for the Kremlin would like to have it this way.
We started a little late, so we'll take a little time and we'll go to with the delay to the bus eventually. I have a small question to Richard. Obviously, there was a lot of violence, but shouldn't we have analytical distinctions between types of violence? You said that, okay, military violence or during the First World War was also chaotic, brutal. Okay, I can see that. However, I just think that this term violence is excessively inflated, because very often we use violence where previously we said power. You know, the German word Gewalt actually means both. Any power is associated with violence.
Yes.
Even if I ask you to cut short your response to a question, it's also violence. And I can do it by violent means if you don't obey. But another thing is violence for the sake of violence, such as the terror. And even there, we have Lenin's terror in 1918, which was consciously framed on the French Revolutionary Terror, and was seen as a military measure, as a measure against the enemy during the wartime. And another thing is Stalin's terror, on which we heard from Oleg, and which obviously has a very different nature. So, it's a comment, but probably I think we should have distinctions there. Instrumental terror, instrumental violence, and violence for the sake of violence. Violence to show, to instill fear, to have a performance of brutality or something.
I think I agree with a lot of what you say, but there are a lot of things going on in your comment. Let me begin by talking about the term being excessively inflated. I mean, this actually is the point that was buried in the second half of my talk. That I would argue that from the middle of the 20th century, roughly, the term has become inflated, whether you consider it excessive or not. I don't want to get into here, but it has been. So, I mean, if you take a look at the development of operational definitions of violence and the way that it tends to be used in juridical terms, there really has been a change. And precisely what you said about whether you speak to me in telling me to shut up because my time is up, that can be taken as violence. And increasingly, it's not merely that may be taken as violence, but the point at which it is defined as violence is in the eye of the purported victim. And this is something which is new. I mean, if you take a look at the development of sort of genealogies of definitions of violence from the 18th and into the 19th century, it was very different then. I mean, the understandings were from the supposed perpetrator of violence. Now it is of the supposed victim. So I think you're right. I mean, the definitions are inflated, and I think that change in definition, change in understanding, and inflation is something which conditions our understanding of our history and also the history of revolution. Now, if I go back to the violence of the revolution, and I didn't really want to make a case about it being, just simply catalog violence of what was going on between 1914 and 1923, 1924, I would say, that you perhaps should make distinctions, but I think there was a lot more going on even than what you were talking about. I mean, it's not simply or merely the policies, let us say, of Leninist terror, or of the beginnings of population transfer and what we now call ethnic cleansing, although there's nothing clean about this whatsoever. And I think it's a term which I don't like to use. Or simply a matter of Stalinist terror. It's also a matter of practices, at the coalface. We're talking about, I think I mentioned this in passing yesterday, in Russia's second time of trouble, shall we say, from 1914 to 1922 roughly, there are estimates that something like 16 million people died. And this isn't simply a matter of government policy. There's an explosion of pogrom violence. This is happening as well. Just unspeakable practices, as the Germans would say, vor Ort. It's not simply in Russia; it happens elsewhere. So I mean, there's also a matter of practice. I wouldn't say it's violence for violence sake, because I think I'm sure you didn't mean it in that way, but I think that's too easy a way out. I mean, I think there are always things behind it. Maybe we just don't understand them. And I think to use this moniker of violence for its own sake is a way of sort of skating past some really difficult and challenging stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Two last questions, Vladimir and then Gal.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question for Oleg, and it's kind of follow-up. Really fantastic presentation, but...
Speak up, please.
Yeah. Really fantastic presentation, but I was a little bit confused. Is it on? It doesn't work. Doesn't work? Doesn't work?
It doesn't.
Yes.
I was a little bit confused by light-hearted way in which you dealt with American comparison. Because for me, it was strange. You have Southern Korean, you have Taiwan case, and what I would think that if you would have the same kind of deep interviews with Americans, the structure would be pretty much the same. You would have inspiration there. And in the creative class, is it Dzerzhinsky invention? Did Rachel from Florida read anything about Strugatsky's, fantasies and creators? I don't think so, and generally so this structure of industry inspiration, how does it correspond to the recent development in the capitalist economy, neoliberalism? Creativity is what you should do to be successful. It's something that is imposed on you. And you can lose your property, you cannot provide for your children, but still there is this inspiration. Please go do it better, be creative. So for me, it's a little bit problematic that you really took out American case. And I think it would be problematic for the people who ask you to do this research. Because if everything is the same in Russia and the US, why things went wrong in Russia?
I will take the Gal's question immediately too.
Yes, thank you for both presentations. I have a short question for both of you. First, in terms of rejection of from 1950s, we have the end of this war revolution topic, and it moved towards violence victim. And as a kind of, I don't know if you have a comment of some kind of humanist discourse that was going on from then on, while at the same time kind of not talking or overshadowing what was happening in the Third World. You have revolutions, you have anti-colonial movements, and you have kind of international or other imperial, let's say, intervention. So there is a certain continuity of the violence and also this metaphor of war and revolution. So to speak, they're silent about those that are quite violently loud about sensitivity, civility, civilization in the West. Then the question maybe for Oleg that goes a little bit into the direction what Susan was saying, Kathy also, the category of the change of the world, or this sentence, changing the world. I think what I have a problem there is that you seem to identify it as some kind of moral category, when it's it's arrogance, it's a sign of arrogance. While if we do kind of insist in kind of historization or kind of this historical differentiation, even within Soviet socialism, you would have something much different or bound to collective project, not just kind of self-sacrifice and revolutionary cause, but there would be also a kind of project of nationalization, electrification, kind of building of social infrastructure, imposing certain egalitarian ideas as well. That can be, of course, also kind of read in 19th century Russia and so on, in different versions of religious but also atheist movements. But at the same time, it's a very different change of the world of Steve Jobs or kind of post-Strugatsky readings in capitalist, like what you say in Cashman, kind of. There is a very strong paradigm of privatization. So there is this, I would just like wish to account for this kind of historical differentiation within socialism, but also between kind of socialism and capitalism.
Thank you. Okay, you go first.
Well, in terms of the creative class of Florida and the creativity by Dzerzhinsky in 1925, well, the two distinctions are of course there. Take a look at the picture, right? Here, the subject of creativity is not the individual, it's the Soviet people, which together, as a subject-object of history, transforms as a revolutionary proletariat, basically both nature and history. Florida is about individuals who are trying to develop something. The second distinction here is that in Russian you'll feel it immediately. I mean, the word sounds the same in English, but the one thing is to be творцом, другое дело делать, креативно доставить месседж внутри пиара. Одно дело, one is the creator of the new world, another one is creatively delivering a message in the PR activities. I mean, you see, I mean, the word is the same in English, but even in Russian, they borrowed the Latin-sounding word to diminish the importance of the second. But I think you're right in one thing, and that is the research should have been done on Americans. Sorry, with Americans. Because there are two usual criticisms here. No, I cite Shapin there because I discussed it with him, and he did lots of interviews. His wife is, you know, in technological entrepreneurship, so he kind of, where is it? You know Steve Shapin, right?
Yeah.
Or about him? Yeah. Anyway, so Shapin did some qualitative interviews, basically more or less talking to 15 to 20 people around his wife and building quite a good, powerful thesis, which is stated in his book. And he also told me, more or less what you're telling me, that actually if you want to claim the specificity of Russian technopreneurs, go to the Silicon Valley. Don't forget that actually 20% of them are Russian there anyway. And then if you have the argument of specificity, prove it. Another one, which is usually coming not from the tech people, but from the social science people, they say, we also have the buzz. We also have this kind of idea that should be enraptured. You should pin me hard. Only when it pins me hard, I really produce a good book. I mean, so what's the difference between social sciences and exact sciences, right? I mean, why do you just claim it to this characteristic of technopreneurs or communists? Here, I think more comparative cases should be built. But the reason I delivered it to you is that at some point we stopped, and that's research as it is, or as it was stopped at 2014 right now. I forgot when Boris emigrated, but that's when we even didn't get the text in the end. Right now I'm doing, as you know, Dignity and Republicanism, so it's a completely different story. If Olga restarts the agenda, we'll tell her what to do next. Now, with the question on changing the world in a different way, which is not technical but rather social as a whole agenda. Definitely, I mean, technical there was subjugated, I guess, to the social agenda. And if we have to write a beautiful argument in a good book, we'll have to take account of that also.
Okay, Richard, brief.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to be brief. But, I mean, it's a. Thank you for the question. It is absolutely essential. I think you're right about this point about overshadowing the third world, because what I was talking about, and I did say this was a Western story, and I'm very conscious of that, And it is about the way we have regarded the revolution. But let me just make a couple of comments. I think you're right about your general point. It's also important to remember what we forgot, and what has not appeared on our radar. Let me just cite a couple of quick things. First, what happens on the 8th of May 1945 in Algiers? It's a massacre. I mean, this is the beginning of the colonial struggles on the day of VE Day, right? When hundreds of people are slaughtered in Algiers in response to, I mean, it's questionable what the uprising was about, but there you are. Another example of this that people don't particularly think about is the history of what happened in Indonesia in 1945 and 1946, 47, where the Dutch, who like to think of themselves as a nice, peaceful, pacifist, reasonable people, managed within a year of being occupied to send 100,000 troops to the other side of the world to kill 500,000 people. And we supplied the boats, the British and the Americans, by the way. And it disappears, and it disappears from Dutch consciousness until in the late 1980s. This is brought up for various reasons within the Netherlands. Yeah, right. Or the degree to which the massacres in Indonesia in 1965 were just not really taken in the West. Or, and I'll shut up after this. I also worked on the Cambridge history of the Second World War, and I was assigned to do the bit on what was referred to as unnatural deaths. We are talking about 60 million people being killed. It's an enormous explosion of violence, which I think also has a very, very important role in how people come out from under it and understand it after the Second World War. Now, we all know which country lost the most people in the Second World War. I mean, how many people really are aware of what country lost the second highest amount? And it's China. And China lost well over 10 million people. And when I listen in the UK about how in 1940 and early 1941, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, we stood alone against the world fighting evil, and of course the rest of the world should be eternally grateful because we saved them. If you think about who is really doing the heavy lifting at that time, it is China, who loses 10 million people. And it's not discussed and it's not there. So I think, yes, it's right. This history has tended to be, as you say, overshadowed. It's important to remember what we forgot and to understand how we forgot it and how this affects our understandings today. And I think this affects the understandings of revolution today as well.
Okay, thank you.